Well, welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles, 24/8. I'm Allison.
And I'm Erika. And before we start, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or stream us on Spotify or on YouTube. And if you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Also, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. You can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. And holy shit.
It's been a minute. It's been a minute.
Been a hot minute, more like 365 hot minutes, kind of. And it's been a year.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people understand that too. 2025 has been a crazy year in so many ways.
Yes.
But luckily for us, the Beatles are still there when we come back to this, so we decided to give it another go.
Exactly. Despite, Sean's worries that people are going to forget about the Beatles. I don't know if you saw that interview.
Oh, I did. You got nothing to worry about.
Nothing to worry about, Sean. Rest your pretty little head. What have you been up to, Erika?
Despite our silence, I've actually been pretty busy in a Beatles capacity. I have my first book coming out this year.
So exciting.
I know. And it's about my favorite topic of all time, the butcher cover.
Yes.
Thanks to the research for the episode that we did a couple of years ago, I've been totally, completely, absolutely obsessed with this topic ever since.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I can't wait to read it.
When we did the episode, there was actually so much more there than I thought from just knowing about the photo. But it turns out that there's so much more even than that. And it ties in with the larger Beatles story. It's not just a strange anomaly in the Beatles' history or a sick prank, like some people say, or a message to Capitol that they were butchering their albums in the US. It was actually a perfect representation of the transitional nature of the time and a microcosm of what was going on with them. And it represents the struggles between the Beatles' own need to grow at the time beyond their early mop-top image while still being constrained by all the forces that created it, the media, the fans, Brian, everything. And then the story of the photographer is fascinating too. He comes into the Beatles circle with the surrealist perspective on photography, influenced by Man Ray and Dolly, that is so different from all the other studio photographers that they're working with at the time. And he's got this specific role within NEMS that no other photographer had had before or ever had since, in that he was designated their official photographer and he stayed with them for 2 full years. So it gave him these opportunities to get to know them, to play, to experiment, and to think about the role of the Beatles in the world and the role of fandom and everything he was seeing.
Oh, wow.
And then there's the Capitol Records part of the story too, which is so interesting in its own right, especially, I think, for next generation fans who maybe didn't even realize that the US record label created this entire parallel catalog just for North American fans, which is the only reason we were able to get something like the Butcher album anyway. The book isn't just a longer version of the episode we did a few years ago. It actually traces the issues that created the Butcher cover all the way back to John and Paul's first meeting, how their image got built in the first place, and how the tensions that were inherent in that image from the start build up into this incident. There's just so much to it. And in addition to what happened before, the book goes beyond the Butcher cover and talks about what happened immediately after, which includes that crazy summer of '66, the Revolver release, the ridiculous events of their Philippines tour, coming to America and facing the more popular than Jesus backlash and the burning of Beatles records. All of these things happened right after. And then even beyond that, there's the Butcher cover's legacy, the way the fans took over, found this image underneath the Yesterday and Today album, and turned it into one of the most popular collector's items in vinyl history. So there's a lot of exciting things. I could talk about it forever. I think most exciting, though, is that the book will feature a ton of rare images, outtake photos from the Robert Whitaker estate and from the Butcher cover photo session, which, of course, is so much more than just the Butcher cover. So, yeah, I'm really excited.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Oh my God. I'm so excited. This has just gotten me, I have like chills. I can't wait to read this book. So when is it coming out?
It should be out first weekend of November this year, 2026, which has been quite a rush to get it done. But the publisher wanted to make sure that it was out within the 60th anniversary year of the Butcher cover.
Fantastic. And it sounds like it'll be out right before the holidays this year, which, I mean, never too early to start thinking about the holidays, guys.
Once I get cover reveal and pre-order information, I'll be able to share that here and talk more about it.
Maybe we should do an episode about your process because I'm sure everybody's curious what it's like to write a Beatles book, because we read them. Everybody listening has read a Beatles book.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It is really interesting, especially because of the internet. I mean, the amount of rabbit holes I've had to go down to find out, did John Lennon really say that thing? And if he did, when did he say it? And where did he actually say it? And can I actually find an audio clip of him saying it? And if I can't, I have to get to the bottom of why it's an issue. And I found so many things like that.
I feel like sometimes the Beatles world and the Beatles literature world is a giant game of telephone. And especially for John, a lot of quotes get attributed to him that are not him. I mean, that is a huge problem. I think we've talked about that before with our John Lennon Sinner or Saint episode, where people deify him and attribute all these like peace and love quotes to him when it's like, no, he never said that actually. Yeah, I'm sure the fact checking of this book must have been its own ordeal.
And it's not only the quotes, it's the photos. Finding the original copyrights. Yeah, there's still even a couple I can't find.
Well, maybe we can crowdsource those for you and see if anybody knows anything.
Oh, yeah, totally. And how was your 2025?
Oh, man, my 2025 was a roller coaster. It was a very stressful summer for a lot of reasons. And unfortunately, I have to share some sad news with our listeners that we lost a very good friend of the pod in October, which was my cat, Epi. He was 18 and he had had a rough summer, and he passed away with me. I was with him. He had a good transition, but of course it's been very hard. And I know he had made some appearances on the pod and he was a friend to all of us. And so he is connected with his namesake, hopefully, in the great beyond. But on an up note, I did go to Egypt over the fall. I went in November.
Ugh, amazing.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily Beatles connected. Although I got to say, I did go and see a Beatles tribute band in Cairo.
How fun.
Yeah, they were very good. Very, very good. They're called Glass Onion and they're on Instagram and probably other platforms as well if you want to check them out. But they were fantastic. And everybody's like, of course, leave it to you to find some Beatles stuff in Egypt, of all places. But, I was very excited to see them and was very glad I did. And it's just, it's amazing how, I was looking around the crowd at the show and I was just like, it's just how the Beatles sort of transcend countries and language and just everything. It was just phenomenal. It's like me from the United States, lives in Los Angeles, from Ohio originally, sitting beside these two gorgeous Egyptian teenagers, and we're all just like fangirling about these songs. Everybody was so into it, and there was a lot of dancing and singing, and it was a phenomenal show, and it was a great way. It was my first night in Egypt, so it was a great way to kick off my trip. So I guess that's my Beatles related thing. But yeah, so then we wrapped up 2025. I came back, and it's the holidays, so now we're here.
Well, despite the very, very unfortunate news about Epi, I'm so glad you had a nice way to end the year at least.
Thank you. Yeah, it was good. It was good. And it was sort of like a slide into 2026. So hopefully onwards and upwards this year. I'm looking forward to definitely your book, looking forward to the pod being back in action and a lot of fun stuff coming up.
And Yeah, I would really love to, if we can, talk to some members of that tribute band you saw. I would be so interested in hearing more about what the scene is like in predominantly non English speaking cultures and how they translate the Beatles, not just in words, but just the feeling of the Beatles into their own culture.
In fact, yes, I think we will have a member of that band on. So watch this space.
Exciting! Yay! I think we're going to have a lot going on this year. There's so much that we didn't cover in 2025. There was Paul's latest tour. There were the new John and Yoko releases. There was, of course, the anthology that came out. We'll hopefully be able to get to all of those things at some point. But today we just wanted to bring up one recent announcement that does affect 2026, which is the fact that the Fest for Beatles fans is not going to be happening this year. The Fest announced just a couple of weeks ago that they're taking the year off to regroup and think about what would be best for the future and what it could look like in light of changes to the fan base and to the availability of special guests they might book.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is a really good idea. There have been rumors floating around for a while that we weren't going to get a fest in 2026. And, I think, there's a lot of opportunity there, but I think it's good that they're kind of taking time to recalibrate it. I think that's the right move.
Yeah, I don't think it's time for the end of the fest or anything like that. It's still a wonderful place to celebrate the music and talk about the history and find your people and to play music with other people. It's great. And all of these things you can do at the fest, no matter who the keynote guests are. But things are changing. A lot of their success was based on the fact that they had these keynote guests from the Beatles world, and they don't have the same availability now that a lot of people have gotten older or passed away. And I think Now and Then was the announcement that that was officially the last Beatles song. Now, it may not be, but releases just aren't coming at the same speed that they might have been in the 70s or the 80s from the solo catalogs and such. But that doesn't mean that there's not so much present day Beatles activity. There's other kinds. There's the movies coming out. There's all of these tribute bands. And there are people out there like Giles Martin who are still working actively with the Beatles story. So there's plenty of opportunities if they can find a way to incorporate them into the fest.
I know. I think it's going to be a balance. And I think also, utilizing the virtual space, because I know, during the pandemic when they had the virtual Beatle Fest, I've heard a lot of people say that was great because you could join from wherever. And, I remember seeing a conversation with, I think, Mary Wilson right before she died. So that was great. I enjoyed joining in, from the comfort of my bed.
And it's very expensive.
It is expensive. It's a hotel, it's the ticket, it's, the food at the hotels is so expensive. Just everything, the drinks, if you want to buy something and the merch room and, so it's not a cheap commitment to go to Beatle Fest. So it's like, if they have like $20 virtual tickets, like, yeah, sign me up, I'll do that. Obviously, the best thing about Beatle Fest is the people and, the hanging out at the bar at the end of the night and having a drink next to Mickey Dolenz, or whatever it is. But, for the fan who just wants to get the meat of it, the content, then, virtual might not be a bad move for that.
Yeah, definitely. That could offset some of the cost. It could make it more accessible to people who can't travel or can't afford that travel. And maybe also they could find ways to attach it to something else. For example, perhaps there's crossover appeal coming up with one of the larger Comic Cons with these big blockbuster movies coming out. It could be an opportunity that they didn't have before.
Yeah, exactly. Right now, it's kind of a quiet period for the Beatles, but I think once these movies start rolling out, it's going to become a huge deal again. And not the Beatles aren't a huge deal, but, we get the ebb and flow of like the releases. And I think once the movies come, they're definitely going to do Comic-Con something. So I don't know, there could be an opportunity there to join forces, but I guess we'll just have to see what the future holds.
This year particularly is an interesting year because we don't go into it with the excitement of knowing that we're getting some big anniversary super deluxe release. Like this year would be the year for Revolver, right? But Revolver already happened, so we know we're not going to get it. They didn't do Rubber Soul. They could still do that. And there's plenty of opportunities for the early stuff like Live at the Star Club or the BBC. There's plenty of other opportunities there.
Yeah.
Though if anybody out there is working for Capitol listening, nobody's ever done a release of the Yesterday and Today album with the Butcher cover on the front.
Plug, hint, hint.
This would be a wonderful year to do it if I do say so myself.
I don't know why nobody's done that yet.
That would sell, even though they're resistant to it. I was reading an article that as late as 1980, when the editors were putting together the US Rarities album, they actually wanted to use the Butcher cover photo as the cover for the Rarities album. And even in 1980, Capitol said no.
That's crazy.
So when they were putting it together, they put it in the gatefold, but that was the only place that they could get it in. So in 1980, Capitol didn't think we were ready for it, but I think we are now.
I think in 2026, we can handle it, maybe.
I hope so.
I hope so. I hope that's where we are as a society. We can handle the Butcher cover.
Anyway, Capitol, if you're listening,
get it in production. Let's do it.
Moving ahead and looking forward, we have a really fun 2026 plan. We do plan to keep going for the year. This won't be our last episode for 12 months or something. We're going to come back in a couple of weeks.
We're not going to do one and done. We're not going to leave you hanging like that. We're ready, raring to go, ready to join back in the Beatles podcast universe.
And this time, we have a fun year planned. We are going to focus on the 60th anniversary of 1966. Anyone who's done any bit of research in the Beatles knows that 1966 was a transformational year. But the amount of both personal and artistic growth in the Beatles, and of course in society, was astronomical. If you think about it, if you look at them at the end of 1965, they were just wrapping up a year that was highlighted by the release of the movie Help. And then they played Shea Stadium. And after those two huge triumphs, they went on this small tour of much smaller venues in the UK toward the end of the year. And at the same time, they'd released Rubber Soul. And while there are many parts of Rubber Soul that are truly transformational and signal a new direction, it was still within the parameters, for the most part, of pop music. It wasn't that much of a break. So if you look at the end of 1965, you'd be thinking more of the same Beatles, maybe with a little bit of a modern twist. But look at what happened just 8 months later. Revolver, which was such a huge jump in artistic maturity, had been released. The band had made the decision to stop touring altogether after a series of horrible summer events and scandals, including their time in the Philippines. Even Revolver, which would be the pinnacle of most other bands' careers had they released it, that wasn't even the end for this year. By the end of 1967, they were headed back into the studio, which would be the most musically and visually ambitious pop music album to date, Sgt. Pepper. And even if you judge the year by their appearances, at the end of December, when we see them on Rubber Soul, we still see the Beatles with longer hair, but we see the mop tops. When you look at how they were merging in the fall of 1966, take a look at John Lennon, who had just played his role, Private Ripweed, in the movie How I Won the War. And he'd come out of that experience with his short hair and his granny glasses, and you just see the transformation.
People talk all the time about how the Beatles and the Beatles world every year is like a decade, because of all the change and all of the innovation and everything that they go through. 66 especially, because it's such a bridge between, 65 Beatles and you think of Help. Like, how do you even connect Help with Sgt. Pepper? But we have this year, this transitional year of 1966, where they make, I don't know, my favorite Beatles album. I think it is the most revolutionary Beatles album, which is Revolver. Then they, like you said, Erica, have all these moments that hallmark the year. To me, it's the most exciting Beatles year.
So, our plan for the year is that every month we're going to discuss what was going on with the band in the same month in 1966. So, we're tracing the beats of this epic transformation month by month.
I can't wait. I'm so excited to like live it in real time.
I think it will be really fascinating, especially because the first 3 months of this year are so exciting. Because as far as the press and the fans were concerned, they weren't doing much of anything. They had very few public interviews. They had no press junkets. They had no live touring dates. They weren't even in the studio, and they didn't even have a movie to film that year. So there was nothing public. It was like an incubation period for their metamorphosis.
Yeah, they had to cocoon themselves.
So we'll talk about this month by month, starting in the next episode where we'll discuss January. But today, as a lead-in, we're going to talk about December 1965. So we can place them in context for the ongoing coverage of 1966. And we'll highlight some of the subtler changes that were already in motion at this point. So by the end of 1965, like we already discussed, the hallmarks of Beatlemania, the haircuts, the screaming girls on tour, the witty bon mots and press conferences, they still define the Beatles' public image. But the familiar tropes were starting to become a bit distorted, which I think the Rubber Soul album art is quite indicative of that, a visual representation.
Yes.
In many ways, they were outgrowing the constraints of what pop music was, and they were trying to find a way to grow as people and as artists, but still grow within the confines of the established pop world. And they'd always been doing this. Since the day John met Paul, they were breaking barriers, they were breaking records. But when they did it, it was still for the most part recognizable as part of the structure of pop music. For example, like their contemporaries like Cliff Richard, they wore suits. But maybe they just had better styles and longer hair. They still sang pop songs, even though they wrote them themselves and were getting progressively more experimental with chords. And they still toured, even though the venues were getting bigger and bigger. But by this point, they were reaching the end of those boundaries. They had conquered the world, and it was becoming harder to grow as recognizable pop stars within those existing structures. A great example of that, of course, is touring. By 1965, there was this juxtaposition as Beatlemania was getting bigger and bigger, playing these gigantic venues, but the novelty of Beatlemania had started wearing really thin for the Beatles. They were getting so frustrated that they couldn't hear themselves play. They were starting to experiment musically, but they could see that their own growth was at odds with the live format. Some of their newer songs couldn't actually be replicated live. And then even with the songs they did replicate on stage, some of the more mature themes or the slower tempos, songs like Babies in Black or I'm a Loser, they don't maybe have the same spark as, for example, rock and roll music in a live concert setting.
You don't want to hear a waltz at a rock concert? Come on.
And they did play Babies in Black, which I always find so strange to hear live.
Yeah. I mean, come on. That's what a uplifting moment, you know?
Right, like about a woman whose boyfriend died. How do you scream to that? I guess you can, but it's a lot harder.
Yeah. Interesting choice. Weird flex,
Yeah,
but okay.
all right. And I think Shea Stadium was the tipping point for all of these things. They played Shea, of course, the previous summer. It was this record-breaking event. Playing in a venue that large ushered in a new era of stadium concerts. The band was just so big that normal venues could no longer hold them. But what was the sacrifice? First, their music quality. You couldn't hear it. The largest possible number of people were gathering to see the Beatles, and they were listening to them through one of the worst possible ways to listen to music. They were listening to them through the PA system that baseball announcers used. It was almost unintelligible. And in fact, in January 66, when they go to overdub and edit the Shea Stadium concert for TV, they found that some of the songs were completely unusable.
Yeah.
The second sacrifice was the Beatles' own love of performing. If you think about them in Hamburg, all night amphetamine-fueled ragers, and now, just a couple of years later, they're doing these tightly controlled 30 minutes and under sets where the music couldn't be heard and what they were playing barely mattered. And I think they became progressively dejected by it. If you listen to the Beatles concert performances in 1965 and going into 66, there was a while where they did not play well. I don't know whether they stopped being able to hear themselves, or they stopped caring, or they just shut down because they were so frustrated by what was happening. But it wasn't really until the Japan concerts in the summer of 66 at the Budokan that they really noticed it, because the guards were forcing everybody to be silent during those concerts. Without the screaming, they could finally hear themselves play, and they were horrified at what they realized was happening.
Yeah, they hadn't realized how much their live performances had sort of disintegrated.
Yeah. And if you hear those concerts, you're like, oh my God.
Whoops.
And I think another thing they noticed, especially around this time, was that they were moving beyond the standard lifespan of a traditional pop star. Most pop music acts maybe lasted 3 years at the most at this time, at which point many would just fade away. Or maybe for some exceptionally talented and enterprising people, they would become more of an all-around performer. They'd do theater or branch out into TV presenting or start recording music that would be palatable to the older generations. Like Cliff Richard is an example of someone who did that and still does that today very well. And of course, Cilla Black would also be a great example of somebody who later on translated into that sort of performer. But the Beatles didn't want to do that. They didn't know what their next move would be. There was no blueprint for a pop star over 25 years old. But what they knew was that it was not going to be more mop tops, because that would be a bit weird. I've got this quote of Paul from December of 1965. He's talking about what he and John might do next. Would you like to read it?
Yeah, I do. Should I try to? I'm not going to try to do a Paul voice.
I mean, you can if you want to.
I don't think so. Nobody wants that. Writing songs or performing? No. No, Paul said in 1965, December, writing songs and performing are equally rewarding. That is when it goes well. But the songwriting thing looks like being the only thing you could do at 60. I wouldn't mind being a white-haired old man writing songs, but I'd hate to be a white-haired old Beatle at the Empress Stadium playing for people. LOL. LOL. He didn't say LOL. I said LOL.
Paul, meet Paul.
Yeah, Paul, meet Paul.
I don't think they had any concept of what they would turn into in the 21st century. There was just no model for that. It wasn't even in their sphere of possibility. And so they were ready to figure out what was next. And they wanted to. They wanted to move forward. They didn't want to drop away. And of course, that instinct to invent new things and to explore was always within them, but at this point, exacerbated by drugs. Marijuana was a staple in their lives by the fall of 1964, when they met Bob Dylan in September at the end of their U.S. tour.
Right.
But the new discovery of 1965 was, of course, psychedelics. Now, John, George, and Ringo had begun their experimentation earlier in 1965. They were excited about it. They were interested in it, how it opened the mind. They were eager to do it. And they, as a trio, were becoming closer as a result of it. But Paul was being left out. He was a bit more reticent. He wasn't against doing LSD, but he was just a little bit more wary of the potential consequences of messing around with the brain. The other Beatles kept trying to convince him to do it, and he kept resisting. But he wasn't left behind for long. And this is one of those things that is often a myth in Beatles history. It's often said that Paul waited until late 1966 to even try LSD. Even Paul says that.
Well, as we know, Paul isn't always the most reliable narrator of Paul's own story.
Right. What else is new? He is not. But based on other eyewitness accounts of people who were with him this day, this event actually occurred in December 1965. And it wasn't even with the other Beatles, which might be a reason why it became myth that it happened so much later, because maybe John, George, or Ringo simply weren't aware of exactly when he had done it because they weren't there.
Right.
And 10 years, 20 years on, when they were being interviewed, of course they didn't recall. But history shows that it was actually in the middle of December 65. And not with the Beatles, it was with Tara Brown, the young Guinness heir who was a friend of John's and Paul's and was the epitome of swinging 60s. He was rich. He loved parties. He loved fashion. He loved fast cars. And he loved drugs. And John and Paul were both invited to Tara Brown's on the night of December 14th, 1965. But John actually declined. He had to get back to the suburbs to his home in Weybridge to Cynthia and young Julian. But Paul accepted. And when he arrived at Tara Brown's Belgravia mansion, he was offered LSD. This time, he did it. And he recounted this experience as, quote, deeply emotional. It lasted over 6 hours, and according to Paul, the trip, quote, opened my eyes to the fact that there is a God and made me a better person. So it was pretty profound for him. I think that establishing the timing of this moment is pretty important in our examination of 1966 as a whole because of the huge difference it made in Paul's mindset. For better or worse, if we start talking about Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, any of these later projects, Paul is that driving force. So I think it matters knowing when he started opening his mind in this way.
Right.
And logically, it makes so much more sense that he did this in late 1965. Those changes were already well underway by late 66 when it was originally said he first took LSD.
And it puts him more in line with the other Beatles, because if he had waited until later in 66, he would have been so far behind. It actually doesn't make sense.
I've heard some arguments defending the later date that Revolver was actually so good and so creative because Paul was trying to prove to his bandmates that he could be just as creative as them without having done the drug.
Oh.
Yeah, but I don't know if he ever said that or where that myth actually came from. I also think that if he had waited so much longer, he probably would have been more obviously ostracized from the other three during that time. I don't know if he could have gone a full year without having joined in, without it being obvious in the Beatles' dynamic, which it was not.
Yeah, that makes more sense to me. Paul really becomes the avant-garde Beatle, starting with Pepper, certainly roots in Revolver, but John often gets the credit. John was so not. John was like absolutely not the avant-garde Beatle. It was Paul, and this is probably where that sort of takes flight.
I think John actually probably took a lot more LSD than Paul ever did.
Probably.
But John's experience was more of ego destruction. It was kind of the opposite of what happened to Paul. And it was very hard for him. It damaged his psyche. I think it turned him inward, whereas for Paul, it turned him outward.
Didn't Paul sign a letter, a public letter saying about the advantages of LSD?
I wouldn't be surprised if he did.
He gave a public interview about it in 67.
I know John was angry about that interview because Paul suddenly comes out so much later and be like, oh, well, we all did LSD, acting like he was the driving force when he was definitely not.
Right. So, yeah. So, I mean, you have Paul in 67 sort of advocating publicly for it. But that is very Paul-like, to sort of bring up the rear on this whole thing and then sort of own it.
But if he's coming out like we all do it together, acting like he was the driving force in it, But it's 1967, and it's been like a year and a half since the events that inspired Dr. Robert happened to John and George. So it might have seemed a little weird that he was now coming out so much later saying that.
That makes sense. That tracks.
And speaking of Tara Brown, I'm sure that many people listening are familiar with that name. He is more commonly remembered in Beatles lore for his horrible, tragic death in a car accident in December 1966. And that John's experience of reading about that car crash in the newspaper became the inspiration for one of the verses of A Day in the Life. But Tara Brown also plays one more interesting, weird little part in the story of December 1965. That year, Paul spent the Christmas holidays at home with his father and his brother Mike. And it turned out that Mike had invited Tara Brown to his father's house for Christmas. Tara was getting divorced, and so he was a bit of a bachelor around town. He needed somewhere to spend the holidays. So on Boxing Day evening, Paul invited Tara to ride out to visit his cousin Betty, who lived a few miles away. And to make the ride more interesting, he said, "Let's take these new mopeds I just got." So they're riding their mopeds, and Paul is not paying attention. He's pointing out scenery, he's looking around, and all of a sudden he trips over a rock and he hits his face in the ground. He chips his front tooth and he cuts his head open and cuts his lip open. It is a bloodbath. It is a really gnarly looking accident. It messes up his face. And despite Brian's many, many requests, Paul didn't actually get this front tooth fixed for 6 months.
I never knew that. He's 6 months. Ugh. I gotta agree with Brian.
Yeah, I know. You can actually see it in the Paperback Writer videos, which they filmed in late May 66. Late May.
That's right. Yes.
He said he tried to hide it by stuffing a piece of chewing gum in it, but it fell out.
Oh my God. Piece of chewing gum. You can tell that's like the most like boy in his 20s thing I've ever heard in my life about the Beatles. Like,
I know, right?
come on. Of course, a kid would say, like, oh, I could just cover it with chewing gum.
So Paul is going into 1965 with this strange front chipped tooth that continues to be very annoying to Brian.
That's hilarious.
A few more interesting moments at the end of 1965. On the 23rd of December, on a car ride out for the holidays, George proposed to Patty Boyd. He had to get Brian's permission first, as it was still looked at as a detriment for a pop star to appear unavailable. But of course, Brian said yes, and all four Beatles, in their different ways, were personally maturing. They were starting families, they were moving out of London, or in the case of Paul, moving into his own place in London, and just becoming more of their own people and less of the collective Beatles persona.
Yes.
And we'll leave you with one final story of 1965 at the end-of-year party at Brian's home in Belgravia. At the end of the party, Brian brought the band up to his attic room after everyone left and presented them with special gifts from their American label, Capitol Records. The gift itself was a scavenger hunt. They would open it and there would be this little egg inside. And the egg would contain a clue to the next present and the next one and the next one. And they'd have to keep opening gifts until they found the final clue, which was a photo of their actual gift. And that gift was a video recorder, like a present-day VCR, that would later in the year be delivered to each Beatle. And they would be the first people in the UK known to have this technology.
Oh.
So it's an interesting foreshadowing to 1966 that right at the end of 1965, they were experiencing brand new ways of making media that they'd never heard of before.
Yeah, I'd never heard the story about the scavenger hunt. That's really cool.
It's an interesting precursor to 66 because the change in their music had so much to do with changes in technology and that they started understanding that not only could they use technology to their advantage, but they could use it to invent new sounds that weren't possible before. And at this same party, Paul also gave his bandmates a technologically inspired gift. He had been playing with his audio recorder at home, and basically he made them a mixtape. What it was a homemade acetate that he had first made on his home tape player. And he created a record that he called Unforgettable. It was this mismatch of popular songs, which started with the song Unforgettable by Nat King Cole and was interspersed with tape loops he had made and experimental music he found. And each piece is introduced by Paul in the style of an American DJ with radio patter.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Unforgettable, a program in which we hope to bring to you old songs, new songs, blue songs, green songs, any songs you want, you name it. We've got it. Sounds from the past, sounds from the moment. All over the place, in every country, every race, creed, people are getting together at Christmas to wish each other a happy. And so, in this program, Unforgettable, we hope that you are not going to forget us and are going to join us on a...
There's about 20 minutes of this thing online, and it's really interesting. It actually reminds me of those recordings that he did. When was that? In the 80s?
Oh, totally.
Ubu Jubu.
Yes. Proto Ubu Jubu. That's a hard thing to say.
Yeah. And the other Beatles recognized the significance of this new gift. George had said of it, quote, "It was a peculiar sound. John, Ringo, and I played it and realized Paul was onto something new. Paul has done a lot in making us realize that there are a lot of electronic songs out there to investigate." And in this way, Paul introduced the others to a sound that would come to define them in 1966 with Tomorrow Never Knows.
Right. It kind of comes full circle.
And again, here's another example of what we were talking about before. Paul was pushing ahead. He was so interested in the avant-garde, and he was showing others the way.
And if you think about what we were just talking about with the drugs, December 1965, Paul takes LSD and Paul also records this unforgettable acetate, So it has to be connected.
A whole new world seems to have been opening up for him, and he wanted to share what was on his mind. And I'm so glad he did, because I think a lot of it was responsible for what was to come in 1966. So this is where we find the Beatles as 1965 turns into 66, and we are ready to embark on a truly wild and transformational year with them. And in our next episode, we'll talk about January, which is ironically one of the quietest months the Beatles will ever experience, and a necessary ingredient to creating the massive change to come.
Wow, well, that really sets the stage for what we're going to get hit with this coming year. And in the Beatles world 60 years ago, certainly big things are on the horizon. So something to look forward to in these future episodes.
And that will be a monthly series. We're going to supplement it, of course, with new authors, the new Wings documentary coming out in February, anything else that comes up on the horizon. When Capitol re-releases the Butcher cover in June, it's coming.
I like how you're manifesting that. Is that like one of your manifestations for the new year?
I am. There's still time. It's already created. They just need to release it.
All right.
Come on, Capitol.
Let's do it.
Get on it.
Let's do it, Capitol. Get on it. Get on it. Get on it. Oh, awesome. Well, until then, thank you so much for joining us after all this time. We're so happy to see you guys again. And it's really, really nice to be back. Thank you so much for listening to BC the Beatles. And as always, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're listening right now. And give us a rating review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond. And you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.